Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to be doing a talk around co-parenting, what it is, what it isn't, planning for co-parenting, building boundaries and structure around it, and how to operate within it, its involvement as well, actually. Some things we're not going to be talking about, I'm just going to touch on though, is parallel parenting, or indeed the opposite end of the spectrum, counter-parenting, when one party or sometimes both parties go out of their way to do the complete opposite of being collaborative and working with one another. Co-parenting is really, really useful, and the opportunity to achieve a good co-parenting relationship is actually more suitable when you've got levels of amicability, when it's low to maybe medium conflict. Co-parenting can be really challenging in a true high conflict situation, but it can still be useful and a way to work even if you've still got high emotion but medium and low conflict. Parallel parenting is actually where you would want to utilize that approach when it comes to a high conflict situation. So if we think about co-parenting, or any other word with the prefix of cooperative, collaborative, cohesive, it's supportive and auxiliary. And one of the main things to try and get home about a good co-parenting relationship, not necessarily a great one, but a good one, a sustainable one, a working partnership, is that you don't necessarily have to be friends. A lot of people assume or make the judgment that actually to be a co-parent, you have to get along. We have to be able to trust and respect and be able to work with one another, but you don't necessarily have to get along. I always like to use the analogy of if you've ever worked somewhere with a colleague in a team who they weren't the person that you would spend your spare time with. You're not going to go for a drink with them after work on a Friday, or you don't share a lot of the same values, or you maybe potentially even like each other to a degree, but you also still know and respect and appreciate and have the unique set of skills for that particular project, right, to help you all achieve your end goal and your result. So that's why we're going to be talking about co-parenting today and setting your planning and boundaries. Give a little bit of context for the people here that maybe don't know me or haven't come across me before, to let you know who I am. So I'm Tom Nash, otherwise known as Mr. Divorce Coach. I'm the UK's premier male divorce coach, something we're proactively trying to change between myself, Sue, and our colleague Mel. In other areas, I'm also one of the co-founders of Divorce Coaching Academy with Sue and Mel, and also with Sue and Jenny Brewer, who was on this morning, of the Family Transitions Company. So very much working constantly within this sphere, working with individuals, professionals that are looking to develop the skills, society and communities and organisations. Personally, I'm a second generation divorcee. I'm the child of divorced parents, and then the later husband and then ex-husband of my own divorce and separation. So I've been living in this world both formally and practically and personally for almost 40 years. I'm also obviously the father, stepfather and co-parent of my own relationship, my own divorce, my own co-parenting relationship, and my step family, my blended family. One of my passion areas, because that personal experience, both as a child, as an adult and a father, is actually focusing on co-parenting, step parenting and blended families, helping people to work through those challenging situations, those real life experiences that come from a relationship breakdown or a divorce, outside of the legal sphere, outside of the financial sphere, but actually the emotional mindset and practicalities of how we operate in this world. Recent census from a couple of years ago suggested that there was somewhere in the region of 4 to 5 million blended families in the UK. I estimate that it's probably much higher than that, particularly when we take into consideration of unmarried cohabitant families and blended families. So this is a real growing space of modern society that we should be paying a lot of attention to, and how we support people. From a professional stance, I'm an internationally certified coach, master practitioner in NLP, timeline therapy and hypnotherapy, as well as CBT. And also a very active member of Resolution, sitting on the Working Together Committee with Sue, again, because we do a lot of work together, and the City of London Collaborative Law Pod. So I thought I'd share a bit of personal experience as to, well, why listen to me, apart from the personal background and the professional skills, but to kind of deep dive into actually what that looks like in real life terms. So you'll probably notice here on a few of these pictures, in each of those, there's 4 children as well as 4 parents. Now, to share a bit of personal story, in a very weird walk twist of fate, my ex-wife's boyfriend, handsome gentleman with a better beard than I, is actually my girlfriend's ex-husband. So yes, we all effectively swapped around as the parents. So then when you think about it, there's this little melting pot of 4 children, 2 from each of our original marriages, who are actually going between the 2 homes, and in each home is the alternate set of bio and non-bio parents. Now, we weren't always friends, I hasten to add. Everyone assumes that we must have always just gotten along and we were friends long beforehand. Not the case at all. I've filled out the C100s, we've had the calls with CAFCAS, we've gone through multiple, down to a final hearings, child arrangement orders, etc. We've done the bitter emails and the slanging matches, and we still managed to find a way back from that. So it can be done. Like I say, you can shift away from high conflict and challenging and high emotions, and can put certain measures in place to help you. We now all share like holidays together, birthdays, Christmases, parents' evening, all those lovely things. And actually what we witness it is the children's happiness. They've now got 4 parents they can go to for support, help, guidance, pocket money, whatever it might be that they need. Off the back of that has created some media attention and trying to help change the narrative around how people can move into co-parenting and blended families and do it differently, do it better. Ultimately put their children at the centre and not the middle. So before we talk about some of the planning and boundaries and some practical steps, it's really important to start looking at what some of those potential problems, challenges, and some of those triggers within a co-parenting relationship. And actually, a large proportion of these are the same and very similar and true whether you're separated or divorced or not, even if you're in a very happy relationship. Okay, so if you've got negative communications or a lack of productive communications, either towards or about one another, that can happen even in content relationships, not necessarily separations and divorce, where there might be a disagreement around rules and boundaries, things like bedtimes, way children are disciplined. Obviously for divorce and separation, the other one big thing there is around new partners, for example. Things like money and schooling can be a huge thing as well. Let's think about all those little intricate details around family life, even when you're married, or together if you're not married, that can cause potential tension between a couple. Just think about all these little things that could be amplified when you're going through a divorce or separation. Okay? If you've got animosity towards one another, that high emotion that we haven't dealt with, haven't worked through, we haven't unpacked it and understood it yet, and that we're actually still bringing that out in actionable behaviours as well. Potentially around things like lack of an understanding, seeing the other's perspective. A lot of the time when I'm working with whether it be individuals or indeed when I'm working with couples in co-parenting, it's not necessarily about agreement, it's about acknowledgement, being able to be heard so they can be understood, not necessarily always agreed with straight away, but having a different perspective so that we can both understand where he's coming from. And typically, we're usually coming from the same places with the same overall arching theme and goal, just differently, and have different approaches and perspectives. So again, that can be a real big trigger and for a lot of challenging parts of co-parenting. One of the big things there around schedule changes as well, particularly for people who have quite rigid or structured co-parenting plans where there's less flex and things like that. Again, where maybe that animosity or emotion can still be quite high, not necessarily the conflict, but schedule changes can be a big thing that can kick off, particularly if they are unpredictable, or which can lead on to the next point there, lack of consistency, broken promises, changes at the last minute. Both for the parent as well as for the other parent, as well as mainly for the children as well. And that can be a huge impact in trying to build your co-parenting relationship. Some of the other points are around things like children's behaviours. Now, I don't know about you, because I know that I did it when I was a kid. I used to play my parents off on each other. If I wanted to achieve something, that was my role as a kid, to test those boundaries, test those limitations. I would go and ask Dad for one thing, he'd say no. I'd go and ask Mum, and she'd say, what would Dad say? And I'd tell her what I wanted her to hear. Right? In the scenario of situation of a separation and divorce, children's behaviour is going to shift. How they may potentially be saying one thing but meaning another, or where we're trying to protect one parent, is going to come out. So again, if we've got poor communication, we're not understanding each other, we haven't got an opportunity to connect, to hear what's really going on from each side with both parents, it's going to be going to create a problematic situation within our co-parenting relationship. if we have a situation where actually we can talk about those changes in behaviours, what's actually going on. I'll give you a real life example. I remember one day when my stepdaughter Leonie had told mum one thing, told me another. And then when we were having a conversation with her at dinner table, she told us that she told dad something different, or dad had told us something different, sorry. So I said, cool, let's ring daddy. So I ring daddy up and he goes, I did not say that. So again, helping to kind of find where's the problems with the behaviours and what they're doing and acting and how they're playing with, potentially playing us off on each other as well. The other things that we've got to consider is about relinquishing control. That can be a big thing that I find with a lot of parents, particularly where you've had one parent that's been the primary carer. I had a very early client of mine, male client, who after his first session, one of the very first bits of homework he had was get himself on a cooking course and learn how to wine. These were things that he hadn't done before that he now needed to learn how to do. And actually by building the consistency and not doing the broken promises that's above it and actually going and putting these in place, we could help to start to relinquish other parts of control and help to trust one another again, actually affording the other person, the other party, the other parent an opportunity to pick up those learnings that maybe they haven't taken on board before. I spent 15 years in the city and was potentially, I would say, a weekend dad for the large proportion of the younger years. But actually, it was one of the reasons through my divorce and separation that made me realise I wanted to be a more present dad. I wanted to learn how to do those other things. I iron the school uniforms, do the school runs and things like that. But it was up to me to start being accountable, to step up and learn what I needed to learn of the bits that I hadn't done before, whilst also relinquishing other controls to mum, things that she needed to take on board as well. And the other big one that comes up a huge proportion of time is outside influences. Other people's opinions, experiences, the things we hear at the school gates, our friends and family, our nearest and dearest who rally around us to pick us back up again. But it's about recognizing when is that actually positively supporting or when it could actually potentially be having a negative impact to our potential co-parenting success. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about planning. Now, one of the first things that I always say to clients when I'm working with them, again, whether it's individuals or as couples, is park co-parenting for a moment. How do you want to co-grandparent? You have 3 children. Your 3 children have 3 children. You've now got 9 first birthdays, 9 future graduations, sweet 16s, etc. How do you want that to be for your grandchildren? How do you actually want them to live in that environment? What do you want them to experience, see, hear, and feel? Equally, how do you want that to feel, see, and experience for your adult children when they're having to consider who comes to what information they share with who, things like that. So actually, this isn't the part about building or planning and building a co-parenting plan. Isn't, yes, it is about the nuts and bolts of here and now. We'll talk a bit about that in a moment, but it's also about the longevity and sustainability of it. Right? You're going to live within this environment forevermore. So how do you actually want that to go? And talking about things like what you can and can't control, looking at what part are you bringing to the table? What's your contribution here and how you can do this differently and do this better? So then we start talking about how do we get someone into the business of co-parenting? How do we start to lessen some of the emotions, work with a lot more of the facts, just as you've heard from other presenters in a number of the other presentations so far. And how do we help to start lessening that emotion, to reducing the potential conflicts, and actually work with the facts and figures of how things are going to operate, right? And how do we look at this in terms of a business terminology and maybe bringing that in if that helps lessen that emotion? So one of the things that I do with a lot of my clients is getting to look at things like what's their co-parenting goal? What do they want to achieve? Again, what does it look, feel, hear, sound like? Right? What's the purpose of their co-parenting relationship? Who's it actually for? And what is it trying to achieve? Right? Helping someone understand what that goal is and when we can start to unpack that in terms of what are some of the potential obstacles within achieving that goal. From a self-reflective perspective, what are some of the realities around that? What are they doing that's maybe not conducive to the situation? How can we help them create a better version of themselves that helps work towards their goal? And then how do we put actionable steps in achieving that? What do they actually need to do in actionable behaviours to be seen and witnessed and experienced and be consistent as well in those behaviours? So they might look at something like your co-parenting values, and you can take any kind of standardized kind of core values exercise and attach it to your co-parenting relationship. What are your co-parenting values? What's important to you as a value, as a parent and as a co-parent? And actually getting both parties to do this, you may find that there could be different phrases, different words or statements that are utilized for that. But when we look underneath those values and where the belief systems sit, we can actually start to look at, again, they're usually coming at things from for the same view, those same things that we want to achieve for the greater good for our children, as well as for our own mental health and well-being, living in this sphere. They're usually very, very well aligned, or at least adjacent to. So actually, there's still quite a lot of commonality. So then actually it's looking at, well, how do we build some common co-parenting values and working together? I actually had a couple a few years ago, quite creative couple, who took this format. They combined their co-parenting values, and they actually put them into like a word jumble as a poster, where you get all the different words coming off from one another. And they made them up into two big posters and put them up in their respective kitchens and in both their new homes. They had quite older children, teenagers, and that became their piece to be accountable to their teenage children, that they would live up to these co-parenting values, and that it was mirrored in both homes. Some of the other things that I also work with parents to do, and again, a lot of people go do this by themselves, is things like their co-parenting or their family roundtables, but creating a structure and agenda. So think of it again like getting in the business of co-parenting. What are we meeting for? What's the purpose? What's the frequency? Are we going with a pre-agreed, mutually agreed agenda, and it might be 1 or it might be 3 points? Where are we having these meetings as well? Is it still within the form of matrimonial home, or someone that could potentially bring up potential contention and be quite triggering for one or both parties? Or is it somewhere impartial, off-site? Foster's great for that. Somewhere public but still private as well. Is it just the parents that are meeting to discuss these topics and getting through the weirdness of actually getting through that process of having to normalize how we're operating with one another, so that we can continue to future plan, right? And continue evolving that co-parenting plan? If you've got slightly older children, teenagers, for example, are they involved in that roundtable? How are we validating and acknowledging their experience? What's working? What's not? What are they happy about? What are they not so happy about? What would they like to see? What's causing difficulties for them? And you'll tend to find it'll be quite simple things about transitions between the homes of what they've got to pick between schools and things like that, right? Being able to see their parents in the same environment, about that actual behavior, that message that we're sending to them, and how they're seeing us operate and integrating with one another. The other thing that parents can do is, outside of a co-parenting plan, which proportionally a lot of people look at in terms of just schedules and things like that, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, but is actually building a co-parenting code of conduct or code of ethics or a charter. Think of it like when you join a new company and you get the company handbook, right? The do's and don'ts, the ground rules, the parameters and how we will operate, how will we communicate, how does the other person like to be communicated to, even where we're communicating. Is that actually online, offline? Are we using a co-parenting app, whatever it might be? Talking about and working out what are those contentious points, what are those experiences, words, phrases, names, people that heighten the emotion of a situation, and how do we manage that within a co-parenting relationship? How do we build some ground rules about that and how we operate? Equally, positives as well. Right? If you're witnessing something, some positivity and some praise that would be warranted in your co-parent, share that. Again, having that in your code of conduct. What are 3, 5, 10 positive attributes that you witness in your co-parent? Sharing that information with them, building it into that code of conduct. What's their unique set of skills that they bring to the table? For example, I'm not particularly great with science, for example, and my oldest son is a huge science guy. He loves it. The dad on the other side of the scenario, his stepdad, fantastic with science and engineering, got that mindset. So actually, that's one of his strengths, and to utilize that. And actually, my son gets more help and better help than he would do if he was utilizing it with me. So again, looking at those attributes of how we help and support one another. Right? Looking at those ground rules of do's and don'ts as well. Right? What is and is not acceptable for both parties, and then how we're operating within that code of conduct. But we would talk a little bit around boundaries. So lovely buzzword that we all use and comes up all the time. Boundaries are effectively those guidelines, those rules, that structure that we build around ourselves or around a situation. Right? And it's up to us to identify them, what they are, but also how they operate and how we keep to them as well, and how we're not kind of constantly opening up the doors of those barriers. But again, this goes to the structure of how we're operating in real life terms in our co-parenting relationship. So I mentioned before, are we looking at using some form of helpful tech? Something like our family wizard, for example. Tech can be really helpful, it can be a hindrance. Are we looking at mirroring core rules within each home, where there may be some differentiation to them as well? We need adaptability. Continuing with a united front, still supporting and backing up the other parent in certain situations. In the minutest of details, when I witnessed that my boys maybe aren't listening to mum about putting the shoes on or whatever it might be at her house, it's my job to still create that united front and back her up. Right? That's her support. Looking at things like deciphering the numbers game. Co-parenting isn't 50-50, it's 100-100, and it's about both you being committed. The schedule is different. That's about the uniqueness of the children's needs as well as also the parents' needs around work and whatever it might be. So finding the unique way of tailoring a co-parenting schedule and deciphering the numbers game that works for you. Think about your effective communication. Are we using things like BIF, for example? Brief, informative, friendly, but firm. How are we communicating? Think about that 7% of our communication strategy is only the words that we use. 38% is delivery, pitch, tone, tonality. And 55% of it is body language. So if our words are incongruent to our body language, we're not communicating effectively. Think about how do we keep the child at the center, not the middle. I had a lovely conversation with someone the other day around, who's quite a visual person, around if you want your child to be in the center and not the middle, well, as a visual perspective, that requires us as the parents to step back so we can see them in the middle. Us coming back from the middle. How do we step back from creating some of our own obstacles and difficulties? Things like active listening skills to help enforce those boundaries and respect other people's as well as our own. Just going to share a few little quick tips, conscious that I don't want to run over on time. I mentioned about tech can be helpful or a hindrance. How are you using tech? Not just co-parenting plans. You would be surprised the amount of people that change their ex's name in their phone, and not just their kid maybe potentially use their phone at some point, but I had a live experience with a client whose very clever, smart electric car, when one parent had texted the other one, came up with a really derogatory name, and the kid's sitting in the back on the way home from school listening to it and knows exactly who it is. So think about your tech, how you're using it, helpful or hindrance. Right? Things like pronouns in co-parenting. Right? I'm all for pronouns, all over my LinkedIn. But when you use pronouns to describe the other parent or make notion to the other parent, describing them in a he, him, she, her fashion, you're actually subconsciously devaluing the parent in the child's hierarchy. And actually what you're taking is and creating is your angst and upset and hurt and whatever it might be from an emotive perspective, and you're creating and morphing that into guilt for your child. Can you have pictures up in your home of the other parent? If you've got quite young children, have them quite low level. You can have them, I remember someone saying that they had a 5-year-old, so they put their pictures quite low down and it didn't need to necessarily impact the adult. Right? Think about how you teach your children about the other parent. Interest, not interrogation. Positively, understanding. It's not about data gathering, it's an understanding that this other person is just as equally important to them. Are they having a good time? What do they enjoy? What are they looking forward to? Right? It's not about interrogation, it's about interest. Notifying things like schools. or any other kind of caring or extracurricular activities together and as early as possible, and to continue so jointly as well. I have one couple who set up a separate email to give to the schools so that both parties got the same information at the same time. Avoid creating the suitcase kid, trying to minimize what is being transitioned. But equally, by the same token, understand what they might like to transition between the two homes. My eldest boy has a bearded dragon as a pet, and that comes between the two homes, and 2 vivariums at each house. Things like equal drop-offs as well. Rather than arriving to the other parents to take the child or children away, actually equally, both of you delivering the child or the children to the other parent. So actually, they don't feel like they're being removed from a situation, they're actually being gifted and delivered to a situation. That can be really helpful just to calm the potential emotions and contentiousness for everybody involved. And then one of the last ones there, which is really important, is I miss you. Again, creating upset, guilt, protection for you by the child. There are many different ways to let your child know that you love them, you'll be thinking of them when you're not there. But using statements like, I miss you, or I'm going to miss you, and things like that, think about what that creates emotively and as a thought, as a feeling for the child or the children. How could you say that differently? A great time at mum's or dad's, right? Looking forward to when you get back. Mummy or daddy's going to be doing ABC. I'm going to be doing this, but I really look forward to hearing about what you guys got up to. They still know you're thinking about them. They still know that fundamentally that you're going to miss them without the emotional angst attached. And then the last point is thinking around communicating parents, right? Pay attention, right? Paying attention to the children and what they're really saying, what those needs are there, but also paying attention to the other parent, right? What information might they be sharing and trying to get through to you? Learn some active listening skills so that you can actually gain clarity and confirmation over what is maybe being communicated to you, so you really understand it. Creating that dialogue and that openness to discuss points. Openly and honestly relay feedback and experiences and needs. What's going on at one house and how that could be adapted at another that might be helpful for the uniqueness of the child, of the children. Things that maybe you're hearing. Again, sharing that back with your co-parent so that you can both be aware of it and understand it. Exploring the options and the opportunities, or indeed the choices that come from that. So, rather than using you and me, I and we, right? How can we look at this situation and what can we be doing differently? What can I bring to the table that would actually help you in that situation, or indeed the child? Communicating from a place without judgment, being open-minded, doing that self-work for our own emotions and how we're coming up to situations. Think about your talk, your tonality, your pitch, your delivery. And the main part is once you've done all of that, that's fantastic. But if we actually don't take the next actionable steps from those points that we've discussed, we get back to the problems, the triggers, the inconsistencies. That is all from me. Any questions at all?
Thanks, Tom. Any questions for Tom? I'm sure it must have brought up a few things that people know that they've done or not done.
I have an example of my own. And thinking about this in real life terms, there's some things that I always say with people when I'm talking about their planning and things like that. Think about those real life situations that can crop up. And this is, again, we're talking about the mistakes and the failures you were talking about last in James' presentation a minute ago, and how you can learn from those. And I remember a couple of years ago, I said to one of the boys Friday after school, I said, oh, we're going to go get haircuts tomorrow. And one of them, can't remember which, said, oh, mummy says you can't go to such and such barbers. And this is when things were still contentious, of course. And I instantly got my back up and went, she can't tell me what to do. I can take my kids to any barbers I want. Thinking about how they take those things on, what they share, what they say back, what had actually transpired, and what I found out was mummy was actually trying to do me a favour because she knew that barbers was really expensive. She was actually saying to the boys, oh, Dad's taking you for your haircut this weekend. Tell him not to go to so-and-so's because they're double the price of the other one and go here. So actually she was trying to do something to help. But again, can you see how quickly you can just one little simple thing, you can get your back up about it. So again, being able to have that connection of trust and find that new form of trust, but that takes us being able to start doing that and lead by example with that, putting ourselves out there to be a bit vulnerable with our co-parent, to share that information openly and honestly.
I've got a question, if that's all right, Tom, please.
By the way.
Okay, I've got a question about if you are stepping in parents, so you're actually step parent, stepdad, or stepmom, and you don't have your own kids, and you're just stepping into someone else's family. Any kind of the tips and advice on that? Because that's going to be, from what I'm hearing from lots of friends and clients and my own partner, and it is quite difficult to be that stepping in parents, especially if you don't have your own kids.
Yeah, okay. So that's the part where the person needs to be working before. They need to understand what role they're going to be playing and how they're integrating, right? So if they don't have children, right, what, let's say, parenting skills do they have? And have they actually discussed the role of a step parent with their new partner? So the parent, the actual parent of the children, how do they see this role? If they have slightly older children, how do the children see this role? If they're teenagers and things like that, right? How do they see them? What are the parameters and the boundaries around what that relationship looks like? Going into play that parent role straight away and disciplinarian and being authoritative, whatever it might be, very early on is going to put you straight on the back foot. This young person hasn't built their bond and their trust with you, right, yet. They will. That takes time, but it also takes commitment and showing up and all those things that we're talking about, right? And actually it's about having, as a step parent, being able to step back and also learn as well. If you haven't got children, you're not the parent. What can you learn from the parent, from their actual parent? How do they discipline? What's going too far, but also what's too short? Step parents can either be fearful, really fearful, but especially ones who don't have children, of either going too far, being too strict, or not wanting to at all, not doing any form of disciplinary. And actually, they need to start building that trust. And part of that is that they will need to step into those shoes at some point, but they should initially always start to take the lead from the biological parent. Their role is a quasi-parenting friendship, in-house therapist support worker, right, as your step parent in those early days. Your role is there to build that trust, build that bond, build that rapport, love and care for them and be there, but to build that connection, not assume that it's there. And the other thing to consider, whether you're a step parent with or without children, is stepchildren, dependent on how the parents co-parent as well, can play quite a large role. The vast majority of stepchildren really do love and care for their step parents. A lot of the time they can actually feel quite guilty to do so, particularly if one parent isn't quite happy about them. So you've got to think there's a lot of angst going on for them, a lot of confusion and internal conflict for them, right? There was various studies around it, and again, dependent on let's say the schedules and the times that you're engaged with the children as a step parent, they say that it can take anything from 2 to 5+ years to blend a family. And if you think that that's 2 years, 2 to 2.5 years, if you are around the children 90+% of the time or something from memory. If you've got them on a 50-50 or less than, you've got them every other weekend, that's going to take a long time.
Also depends on the age of the children as well. If you've got late teens, early adults, then you've got no influence on their character or anything like that. Whereas if you inherit them when they're very young, you can have a major influence on their upbringing and their character.
Yeah.
I shall